So you've just written a very chunky report on UK energy security. Why did you decide to look into that in a deep dive kind of way?
Actually, it was a follow-up to a report I'd written as Shadow Defence Secretary back in 2006-07. At the time, it was called Over a Barrel, and it said unless we get an energy security policy that looks at diversity of supply, sooner or later, geopolitics will catch up with us. We did the second one because we wanted to add in the debate about decarbonisation. And one of the things that for me was most important was to try to get away from the debate just about electricity generation. And we keep on talking about 52% of our electricity generations from renewables. That's great. But only 19% of our energy usage is electricity. It's 44% oil for transport and industry and 31% gas. And as long as we're going to use fossil fuels, we've got to be much more circumspect about where we get them.
And you mentioned that your report, your first report was called Over a Barrel. Is Over a Barrel where we are now?
Yes. And I don't think that was unpredictable either. I think it's come late to many politicians that we got ourselves into this position. When we wrote the most recent one, we were very critical of Germany and Nord Stream 2, saying that it would make not just Germany more dependent on Russian gas, but through Germany, the European Union, and indirectly countries like the UK. And I think the key message from it all was global problems require global solutions. And one country going off in its own direction can indirectly harm even its friends and allies.
So diesel is now at £2 at some petrol stations. Unleaded is heading that way as well. How bad do you think this is going to get? This is important to everybody here. It's a very tangible kind of sign of where things are going. How bad do you think these fuel prices are going to get at the pumps?
Well, you have a double hit here. We already had high fuel prices because of the pace of recovery from the pandemic was higher than expected. Supplies weren't as high as they were expected, and you'd a mismatch of supply and demand. So prices were already up there. Ukraine's caused another shock in that system. We've seen, of course, Brent crude and others come off the top in terms of price. That may now ease, particularly if we get any sort of peace agreement in Ukraine. But the shock's still there now in the system. I was listening, in fact, last night to Mervyn King, Lord King, who actually said that the increase in the prices that we're paying because of Ukraine and the knock-on effect was in effect an external tax being imposed on all of us because of our own response to Ukraine. And he's absolutely right. His view was that's something that we should be willing to bear because it's how we help contribute to the fall of the Putin regime. But nonetheless, that's caused a lot of hardship to families up and down the country.
That's a really interesting kind of gloss to put on it for people who are filling up their cars and it's £100 to fill up a small, family car. Was he saying, and are you suggesting that people should almost sort of see that as their contribution to the war effort?
I think it's inevitable that there is some element of that, but in the bigger picture, we haven't diversified enough to ensure that we have both energy security and in the decarbonisation debate that we don't introduce unnecessarily high fuel prices to people. I think all of these things now will require a rethink. I mean, I think that the pandemic was putting a whole lot of different pressures on us. I think the war in Ukraine will add to that. And I think we do need to rethink the pace at which we're moving some of these policies.
And regarding where we are now with Russia, do you think the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence have been kind of culpably complacent over the years about the threat from President Putin?
No, I don't. I think that the West in general hasn't understood what Putin was saying. I mean, I quite often was regarded as being a hawk and a warmonger on all these things, because Putin back in 2007, in the speech he gave at the Munich Security Conference, effectively told us what he was going to do. He also gave us a glimpse of his bizarre worldview that the fall of the Berlin Wall was a conscious choice by the Russian people, he said, to be able to bring more openness and democracy to Europe. I mean, it does take from
Quite a
your
leap.
reaction. It does take a little bit of a
Yeah.
a leap of faith to even grasp where he's coming from. But we got Chechnya, Georgia, annexation of Crimea. I mean, how many warnings did we need to say that Putin is not mad? Putin is bad.
But could
he's
the UK have
consistently
done
bad.
more? Could the UK have done more over the years?
Well, I think we did far more than most. We actually paid our bills into NATO, for example, and when other countries were not doing so, we were modernising our armed forces at a time when many others were not. And it's great to hear the new German Chancellor saying that Germany will now pay its full share, but we're more than a decade in arrears, as it were, and lots of other European countries still not spending what they want. Our enemies see these things and they make their calculations accordingly. Then, of course, you've got the withdrawal from Afghanistan on top of all of that and the signals that sent.
So regarding the UK's energy security, what do you see as our key vulnerability?
Well, our key vulnerabilities are still our huge dependence on imported oil and gas. I'd like to see us diversify. I think that for an energy security policy, you've got to have three things. You've got to have diversity of the fuels you use, and that means we have to use a mixture of fossil fuels, renewables, nuclear, particularly things like small modular reactors, and a British technology that we can actually utilise. You also, secondly, need to have security of the sources where they come from, and then you've got to have adequate maritime forces to guarantee the safety. Given, for example, a third of the world's oil passing through the Strait of Hormuz, where Iran's hardly a friend.
So where are you on the value of shale gas in the UK? And do you think that people have properly understood the difference between the commodity shale gas and the methodology, which has obviously been very controversial, the fracking extraction?
I think in Britain, I think you're absolutely right. We have a tendency to focus on a word. I think the same has been true in the cladding debate in the UK, where it's been not about fire safety, it's been about one element of that. I think the same is true in the fracking and shale gas debate. I think we need to have that debate about, do we want to have more of our own resources produced in a way that we can guarantee in our own country, but take into account, obviously, we are a democracy, what people think about the process and whether you can get public acceptance for either that or different ways of shale gas extraction.
Is it true, do you think, that much of the environmental campaigning against fracking many years ago was actually funded indirectly by Russian interests?
I don't know enough about it to be able to answer that. But certainly if I were trying to get a monopoly on selling a particular product, I would be coming down hard on any potential competition.
So Boris Johnson was in Saudi yesterday trying to negotiate a greater supply of energy from the Gulf. What implications do you think that has for the UK's energy security? Do you think that was a good move?
Yes. As I said, diversity of supply is key. Europe became too dependent on Russian gas. Therefore, Putin had a lever over Europe. I don't think that he believed that Europe would react in the way that it has. But nonetheless, it was there. And I think that it's not a question of using more fossil fuel. And I hear, the Green lobby going crazy about the fact that, we shouldn't be increasing fuel production. It's not about increasing fuel usage. It's most of us recognise that we're on this path to decarbonisation. But it's about, while we're dependent on fossil fuels, while we need to use them, actually getting diversity of supply and therefore security.
And there was, quite predictably enough, a lot of criticism of that trip, primarily but not exclusively from the left, because of Saudi's military activities in Yemen and human rights questions. Is that parallel with Russia fair? Absolutely
not. There are not many people more anti-death penalty than I am. But you have to remember that when it comes to the war in Yemen, that this was a war taken to the Saudis by the Iranian-backed Houthis, including firing missiles into close to Riyadh. So what were the Saudis supposed to do? Just allow their people to be attacked? So it always strikes me something odd about Western media, that they're very willing to attack Saudi Arabia, but very reticent about attacking Iran's backing of the people who actually took the war to the Saudis. Leaving both those aside, the primary job of any government is the protection of its own people and the security of its own people, and that includes energy security. So the Prime Minister was 100% justified in the visit that he made to the UAE and to Saudi.
And where are you on net zero? Do you agree with the time frame that's been set for the UK in particular?
Well, I think there's a problem in setting a time frame. In other words, setting a time at which you will reach your destination without having a roadmap of how you get there. So I think the aim is absolutely right. I think we should be aiming for decarbonisation. We should be aiming for net zero, but we need to know how we'll get there. And so we need to know the rate at which we will be developing other forms of energy generation. So, for example, in nuclear, where I think big new power stations like Hinkley, the one close to me in Somerset, I think that will be the last of its kind. I think we will look to other forms of nuclear generation, particularly things like small modular reactors. But we need to know what that mix will be. And wishful thinking is no more a useful instrument in energy security than it is in foreign policy.
Is it your instinct that the time frame for net zero 2050 is too ambitious for the UK and will end up being watered down in some way just because of pure pragmatism?
I think the answer to all our questions around decarbonisation will come with technology. Technology will be our answer, as it always has been. Our ability to, where we do continue to use fossil fuels, to make them much greener, much less polluting than they are today. Some of that technology is already in development. And how do we use other forms of energy generation? People talk about hydrogen, for example. We've still got some way to go on that, but clearly were we to develop that, or even better, to move forward in fusion, that would actually be a big answer. But technology is, and investment therefore in technology, is a key part of what we will be able to do.
So do you think we'll be able to do it by 2050?
I don't know. And because I don't know the roadmap, as I say, I don't know the time we'll get to the destination. And I think plucking dates out of the air when you don't know what the path to that is, I think is at best a good guess.
That is effectively what the government has done, though, isn't it? Plucked dates.
Well, I think that they would see it as a target. You know, that's what we're trying to achieve. Whether, in direct answer to your question, that's realistic or not is a different debate.
You mentioned Hinkley Point. Of course, that was very controversially. That involved some Chinese investment. Was that a mistake? Do you think that we should actually have a kind of ban as a policy on foreign investment in critical national infrastructure of that kind? Well,
I think there's foreign investment and foreign investment. I would draw a big distinction between United States investment or another democratic Western ally and countries like Russia or China. Interestingly, I was talking to students a couple of days ago at the European College in Belgium, and I was saying to them that, you know, we have to remember that we don't just have a different worldview from Russia and China. We have a better worldview because ours is imbued with human rights, democracy, liberty, and the rule of law. Countries that abide by those things are a much better bet as partners.
Just moving on to, moving back to Russia, what do you think that President Putin will do next? You mentioned the possibility of some kind of negotiated settlement within the next couple of weeks, which of course we all hope will happen sooner rather than later. How do you see things playing out?
Well, I think that for Putin, he's clearly miscalculated. He must now see that. He didn't commit the number of troops that would have been required to take and hold Ukrainian territory. So he presumably believed that he would be welcomed as some kind of liberator. Quite how you would get to that view is very difficult, unless you're a dictator surrounded by very few people who are willing to tell you the truth. And very often that's where dictators end up. But it's clear that he's bitten off more than he can chew, that the Russian military capabilities and logistics have been sorely lacking. They've resorted to semi-medieval siege tactics. They haven't got control of the air. So as a military machine, it has massively underperformed in what must be Putin's eyes. And no doubt the military in Russia, who will have the additional problem that in preparing the Russian people for this invasion, he kept saying the Ukrainian people are our people. We are one people. It's quite difficult then to ask your troops to fire on them. Yeah. And then, we wonder about some of the stories we hear about Russian troops going AWOL. So he is in a difficult position. He can't win in his terms. How does he get out of it? In his terms, he'll be looking for some sort of security stroke neutrality argument or agreement from the Ukrainians, I imagine. And then I imagine that we may end up in some sort of peace for money. In other words, we'll start unfreezing assets, but only once Russia remove the threat from the Ukrainian people.
And do you think at that point that he, will be suitably kind of sobered by the experience of the last few weeks, which, as you say, has not gone to plan, not to attempt anything further? I mean, perhaps this would be a good outcome for the region, at least.
Well, it's a terrible outcome because so many people have died.
Of course. Yeah.
And there's been so much wanton destruction. Will this be the end of Putin?
Yeah.
I think sooner or later it will be.
Yeah.
It took Russia 10 years, though, to be exhausted by Afghanistan following their invasion there.
Yeah.
This, I think, will be quicker. And I think there are a couple of things. One is how much will this have really damaged his reputation inside the Russian military?
Yeah.
And secondly, if you put yourself into the place of a young lieutenant colonel in the Russian army, how long do you think you want to be bossed by a very small clique of 70-year-olds who are all in the KGB and all come from St. Petersburg?
Yeah.
So you can see the tensions building inside the system. That's before the poor Russian people feel the brutal bite that our sanctions will have, particularly the sanctions on the central bank.
You mentioned control of the air. Where are you on a no-fly zone?
I didn't support a no-fly zone because it's not simply a question of sending up planes and stopping Russians flying. We would have to ensure the safety of our own pilots. That would mean, in advance, bombing Russian anti-aircraft sites. That would mean bombing Russian territory. And leaving aside that that's obviously an increase in the conflagration in Europe itself, it plays right into Putin's narrative, which this is a Russian defensive war against NATO. And I think that would have been politically a big mistake.
Finally, you mentioned the poor people of Russia. We've seen some remarkable bravery from some Russians, including the journalist who popped up on her own channel with that message to people not to believe the fake news they were being fed. How concerned are you for that journalist and what will happen to her? Extremely.
I think it was a phenomenal act of personal courage. Someone who actually reports on the news, a news presenter like that, knows the price that journalists have paid for being critics of Putin. He was on TV just a few hours ago talking about traitors and scum, people who disagree with him. She's been fined so far, but she hasn't actually gone through the whole process of Russian law, which she could get up to 15 years in jail simply for saying this is propaganda. Now, if that doesn't make you believe that our way of life is infinitely superior to the Russian regime, I really don't know what does. Should she get out of Russia? Well, if she could get out of Russia, I'm sure that would be something that would be on her mind. Russia is not a country you just get out of. It's not like going to Heathrow and getting on a plane. I'm quite surprised she got out of jail at all. But I mean, do you think her life will be at risk? Yes. Liam Fox, thank you.